We're going to keep doing this because it's interesting. We just got done with the video, and then we got off camera and kept talking. So the headline of this video is, why is this game different than 2017 and 2018? I'm making the point about those 1-point games, Nathan, Stephen, Doug for cleveland.com, those 1-point games the past 2 years, and why, to me, this feels like it could be in the same realm. And these guys are telling me why that's not the same. Why does this not feel like it did in 17 and 18? What makes this different, Stephen?
This is a team who's averaging 50 points a game, but they're also only allowing 9 points per game. I don't know when the last time a team has led the league in both scoring and points allowed, but that's a ridiculous level to be at for any team. And you made a point off camera where you said, we think that this team is good enough. No, I think it's week 10. It's time to start saying we know. We think is a week 5 thing where maybe you've played one quality game and you showed some things, but okay, can you do it again? We've seen it against Michigan State. We saw it against Wisconsin. And obviously, they didn't play anybody the last 2 weeks, but we've seen what can happen when Ohio State gets into these big games where it's the same. It's literally the same exact scenario as the Wisconsin game. It's a noon game on Fox, and the world is going to be watching, and Ohio State looks like they're going to be ready to play once again. They just got the best player in the country back. So I don't think it's going to end up the same way it has the last 2 seasons because, this team's offense is one of the best offenses in the country, and the defense is the best defense in the country, and Penn State does not have that.
The difference between the Wisconsin game and the Penn State game is Wisconsin is Wisconsin and Penn State is Penn State, and I think that's a huge difference. What do you think?
I see where you're coming from on that there is a different collection of athletes at Penn State than there is at Wisconsin or probably even Michigan State right now, and that factors into why you think that they might be able to compete late in the games, and that is a factor into why they competed late into the game the last 2 years and beat them 3 years ago. I think the biggest difference for Saturday, though, is that this Ohio State team is just that much better. The last year and year before, Ohio State was very, very good. 11-win teams, one of the best teams in college football, but they were not in that upper elite tier where it was just a no doubt that team needs to be in the playoffs because obviously that's not where they ended up. There was enough.
In 17 on Selection Day in 2017, we thought they were going. They finished 5th by a hair to Alabama.
Yeah, but they didn't. They were in that 4-5 conversation. They were not a no-doubt team. And this year they are a no-doubt team. Obviously, things could happen. They could possibly lose a game. But there just seems to be – you can look at the performance. There is a separation of how this team is destroying everybody in its path compared to what you saw from them the last 2 years. This Ohio State team is that much better.
There's no holes. In 17, there was a hole. In 18, there was a hole where if a team did have equal talent, the way Ryan Day said, you could exploit that hole. There's no hole this year.
I'm not disagreeing with how good Ohio State is. If Penn State had beaten Minnesota, would you guys think the same thing? What if Penn State had come back and beaten Minnesota and they were number 5 in the country and they were still undefeated? Would you be saying the exact same things you're saying right now?
Yeah, I think so because, again, I think it comes down to performance. Even when Penn State was the 4th team, we were still in the CFP rankings. We were still having the conversation, well, are they really that good, or are they just the best of the next tier down behind where LSU, Clemson, and Ohio State have been living for most of the season, especially in the case of LSU and Ohio State. So, and I still think that applies. My opinion of Penn State hasn't necessarily changed dramatically over the last 2 weeks. I just think the last 2 weeks have given me pause just because they have struggled in a lot of different ways that they weren't necessarily struggling the first 8 weeks.
So you guys basically think then that there's only 2 or 3 teams in college football that if they were playing in Ohio Stadium that you think would not get blown out by Ohio State. Because, again, we're not making our game picks. I'm making the case for I think this is a game. You guys are thinking it's not going to be a game. So with what you're saying if they played Clemson or LSU or Georgia or Alabama or maybe teams like that, Ohio State wouldn't blow them out. But if we believe Penn State is near the top of that second tier, then everybody else in college football would lose by 21 in Ohio Stadium.
Yeah, mainly because I don't like when Ohio State goes on those runs, I don't think Penn State is good enough to sustain that the way that a Clemson or an Alabama or an LSU could.
Okay, so it's just about tiers. It's about you think Ohio State would blow out everybody in college football except like 3 teams.
We just haven't seen any team be able to sustain any kind of an offense against
because the teams, and I'm not making the case that like Ohio State hasn't played anybody. Michigan State's a fraud. Wisconsin is kind of a fraud. So like all credit And all credit, I get it. Indiana has a good record, and Indiana played Penn State tight, and Cincinnati has a good record. I get it. Like, if we're talking about tiers, those teams are so far below Penn State. So far below. So far below in terms of competing with Ohio State. I'm not necessarily talking about when Penn State plays those teams. I'm talking about when Penn State athletically, multiple positions, players you put on the field. The players that Michigan State and Wisconsin puts on the field and tries to beat Ohio State with are half as talented as the players Penn State puts on the field to try to beat Ohio State with, which is why I think it'll be a game.
This is less about like what Ohio State has done this season and more about we saw Penn State struggle against Minnesota and it led to a loss. Basically, what in your scenario where they're still undefeated, okay, they just don't throw an interception in the red zone at the end of the game. And then we saw them struggle with Indiana. You're struggling with teams that we know would get blown out by Ohio State, especially we saw Indiana get blown out by Ohio State, and Penn State struggled with that team. And yeah, they're they might be at the top of that next tier, but there's still a gap between that tier 1 and tier 2.
I don't disagree that there's a gap. I think the gap is smaller than you guys think it is, and I think that Penn State believes they can play with Ohio State, which very few teams come into this stadium believing. And the Indiana team that Penn State played last week, I think, is more developed and more confident than the Indiana team that came and got their doors blown off by Ohio State. So that's a little tougher mismatch. I don't think Ohio State would only beat Indiana by 7.
That may be true. Do you think if KJ Hamler can't play, can Penn State compete with Ohio State?
That's a big factor. He's their most dangerous offensive guy.
You take just that one guy off the field, doesn't that really cripple their chances of doing anything against this Ohio State defense, at least, or not consistently doing something against this Ohio State defense?
It's turning into a podcast.
If you guys don't listen to the podcast, this is what the podcast is like. So, I mean, we know videos are supposed to be shorter, but like this is kind of interesting. It would really hurt their chances. I mean, if you take if Chase Young doesn't play in this game, how big of a deal is that for Ohio State? Like, pretty big, right? So, I mean, if we're going to play the game, does Penn State have as many good players as Ohio State? No. Does Penn State have more good, talented players than anybody else Ohio State has played this year? Undoubtedly. Does Penn State know how to hang with Ohio State? More than anybody. More than Michigan does, I'll tell you that. More than Michigan does, and that's part of it. That's not all of it. That doesn't make you beat them, but it makes you believe you can beat them, which most teams do not come to Ohio Stadium and think. Listen, we'll do the rest of it on our podcast, Buckeye Talk Podcast. If you don't listen, try it. Try the texts. If you gave up on this video, after 40 seconds, that's fine. We usually do them shorter. It's just interesting. We'll keep talking about it at cleveland.com.